Is there a most egregious atrocity that you encountered throughout your entire career?
The cases of doctors and nurses who intentionally murdered their patients. I'm not talking about like Kevorkian, somebody that's assisting suicide. I'm talking about medical professionals who intentionally murdered their patients in the VA system. When you speak about your traditional serial killers, you talk about, 4 or 5 deaths. Well, they were actually amateurs compared to my medical serial killers. Many of them have killed 30, 60, 100, 150 people. A nurse in Italy was accused of killing 30 patients. What she would do is take a selfie of herself and the victim.
Jesus, it's creepy as fuck. Of all the cases that you were involved in, which one was the highest body count?
Michael Swango. I didn't think in the United States of America you could spend time in prison for poisoning people and come out and be a physician, but I was wrong. Next thing you know, patients are dying unexpectedly. Poisoning is a very quiet, non-confrontational form of murder, perfect for the hospital setting.
Welcome to Mic Drop, the podcast where relevancy is irrelevant and we don't give a shit about your feelings.
Ladies and gentlemen, as always, it's both an honor and a pleasure to welcome my next guest to the podcast. He's a former special agent for criminal investigations with the Department of Veterans Affairs. He's the author of Behind the Murder Curtain, which is a book about hunting doctors and nurses that kill veterans. He's the president of the Society of Professional Investigators, which ultimately the career that he's encompassed has been in charge of investigating 295 VA facilities. I didn't realize there was that many of them.
Well, that's just in the Northeast.
Yeah.
Because throughout the country, there are many, many more facilities. Yeah.
He essentially investigates the investigators. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the stage, Bruce Sackman.
Thank you very much for having me, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for coming. I know it's a long trip. I appreciate you coming in. Hopefully it's not too hot for you here. What's the worst VA facility in America that you've ever been to?
Oh, I don't want to say that there is a worse VA facility. When you have 175 hospitals in a system, not all hospitals are going to be created equal. In fact, not all hospitals are going to have the departments that are the same. You can have the department that's on the 6th floor that's outstanding and a department on the 5th floor that's terrible.
Yeah.
So I really can't say that one facility is particularly worse than the other. I think most of them are pretty darn good.
Yeah.
But from time to time, problems do occur in any system, whether it be the VA or not, that has 175 hospitals.
Is there a best VA facility? Is there one that stands out as being like, holy shit, this is the pinnacle of care?
In my experience, I thought that it really varied from department to department.
So it's that nuanced and microscopic to where there's that much autonomy within one hospital to where there's departments that are really, really good and some that are terrible all within.
Absolutely.
I mean, so is that consistent with civilian hospitals as well, or?
Oh, it is.
Okay. I guess to me it seems like, I guess I didn't realize that a hospital was that independent, that there was certain floors or departments that were really good and terrible all within one hospital. I would think that like if somebody's running the hospital, is there not somebody running the hospital, a CEO of the hospital that, makes sure that there's kind of an overall standard that at least is above a certain level?
Well, yes, there certainly is, but it depends on the chairman of the particular department. It depends on a lot of factors. So I can't really say that I found, and I covered all the VA hospitals from West Virginia to Maine, all the outpatient clinics and the regional offices. And I can't say that one was particularly better than the next, although as I think about it, I wasn't too particularly happy with the Washington, D.C. VA Medical Center, but I think since that time they've improved a lot. In fact, VAs in general have improved a lot over the years. Historically, if you recall that film Born on the 4th of July, and remember how terrible they were talking about the VA hospital in the Bronx?
Yeah.
Well, the VA hospital in the Bronx back in the 70s was pretty terrible.
Yeah.
But it's improved dramatically. And the VA in its entirety has really improved dramatically.
Yeah.
But in any hospital system with 175 hospitals, you're going to have some problems.
Sure.
Definitely.
Yeah. And we'll certainly get into some of those. Is there a most egregious atrocity that you encountered throughout your entire career?
Yeah, that would have to be the cases of doctors and nurses who intentionally murdered their patients. And when I say murdered their patients, I'm not talking about like Kevorkian, somebody that's assisting suicide. I'm talking about medical professionals who intentionally murdered their patients in the VA system.
Wow.
That far and above the worst crimes. And you have to remember, in any hospital system, Mike, there are a lot of potential problems and crimes that occur. Hospitals are like small cities. Just think about all the procurement they do. I mean, they procure everything from diapers to the most complex scientific equipment. They have narcotics. They have nuclear radiation. They have personal records that they have to secure electronically and physically. So just putting aside even the malpractice issues, just look at all the potential problems, all the potential crimes that could go on in any hospital, whether it be the VA or not. There are a lot. So when I was the special agent in charge of the Northeast Field Office, I had a tremendous inventory of cases to pick and choose from before I even got involved in suspicious deaths. We had bribery cases. For instance, if you're a contractor and you want to get into a system that has 175 hospitals or even a handful of hospitals, obtaining a contract like that could change your life.
Yeah.
So you might be inclined to bribe some employees to get in there.
Yeah.
Right? So we had bribery cases. We had contract fraud cases. We had fiduciary cases where court-appointed or VA-appointed fiduciaries would actually embezzle the money from the accounts of incompetent veterans. Could you imagine that? How terrible that is.
Jesus.
And we've had benefit fraud. So there were so many cases in the smorgasbord that we had to pick and choose from that we didn't even think about doctors or nurses intentionally murdering their cases murdering their patients until one of these cases actually surfaced.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, again, it's like not really thinking of it that way. I think most people's naivete or assumption that, hospitals and doctors and like everything is totally above board and that they're just on a different level, that you would never expect certain things like that. But assuming that civilian hospitals are really no different. But I guess the one big kind of stark contrast that seems to me like would be a probably the most driving factor for stuff like this is the fact that VA systems are all government run essentially, is they're not for profit the way other hospitals are. And so I mean, to me that is kind of the big difference that would allow or maybe incentivize certain things like that to happen, right?
It's interesting you say that, Mike, because I actually early on was the opinion of just the opposite. I was saying if there's no profit motive for the managers here, why would they cover up crimes? I mean, I didn't see what the benefit was to them. But then in short order, I learned because they were so concerned about the reputation of their particular facility and their own careers that even though it wasn't a financial incentive for them, they were oftentimes still inclined to cover up crimes that had occurred at the VA.
Yeah.
And that really bothered me. It really bothered me a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I can only imagine some of the things you've come across.
What are the two key components for canine success? That's effective training and proper nutrition. Fueled by Team Dog brings those two components to your family and best friend. The perfect nutritional balance that results in a higher mental acuity, energy, overall vitality, and even an improved appearance. Every product you will find in my company's store was born from the battlefield and not from the boardroom. Let my life's work help you become your dog's hero.
Before we get too much further into it, one thing I like to ask all guests, what is your morning routine?
Well, I could tell you what my morning routine used to be.
Yeah.
When I was working, I used to get up at 4 a.m. to work out, and then I would catch the Long Island Railroad into the city, and then I would begin my day like that. But now that I'm not working full-time, I sleep a little later, and my wife and I, we get up and we walk and we exercise, and then we start our day. And I do a lot of reading and consulting with law enforcement and other organizations. Anytime a case of this nature surfaces, I always like to be involved. I've learned a lot after doing these cases for 20 years. So I offer my assistance to law enforcement.
Do you do like expert witness kind of stuff also? Or?
I've done some on occasion. Yeah. On occasion, yes.
Are you originally from New York, or what? Tell me about your childhood.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in a New York City housing project.
Really?
Yes.
What borough?
In Brooklyn.
Really?
And I lived there for 17 years of my life. And then after that, we moved out into an apartment where we had our own balcony. And I couldn't believe it. I thought, wow, this is really great. In a place called Trump Village.
Really?
Yes, where Trump's dad had actually built it. So we lived there for many years, and then we got married, and we moved out to Long Island. But I'm a product of the New York City school system, and I went to a college in New York, so I'm a born and bred New Yorker.
So you're a big Red Sox fan. What decade span was that from birth until?
All right. Well, I was born in 1951.
All right.
All right.
So
you could figure out the rest.
Yeah. So I mean, back then, I guess, not to get too far off topic, but just out of curiosity, I mean, to me, New York City is one of those cities that, all cities have a lot of personality, but I mean, it'd be hard to argue that there is another city on the planet that has as much kind of vibrance and attitude and character as New York City does, or it's at least as much that way as any other city on the planet. How much have things changed since, say you were a kid, from when it was then? Yeah,
it's changed a lot. It changed a lot. The New York City school system at one point in time used to be the best public school system in the country. It's no longer like that. New York City, particularly under Mayor Rudy Giuliani and Mayor Bloomberg, was the safest large city in America. It's not that way anymore.
Yeah.
It's not that way. So I'm hopeful that it's going to come back to the way it was. But right now, I'm a little disappointed in the way things are.
Yeah. Well, is there a biggest contributing factor from your perspective? Not to get political, I guess, but.
I would say that there's currently a lack of adequate support for our law enforcement and our court system. Even according to our mayor, our judicial system is all screwed up. I mean, the police are arresting people and they're out on the street before the cop is even done with his paperwork. And I'm talking about felonies. I'm talking about serious crime. So until that changes, New York has a way to go to come back.
Yeah. And do you live in Long Island now?
Yes.
Yeah. What, again, without getting too far off topic, how would you synopsize the different boroughs in terms of personality? Like to summarize it.
Well, historically, there's always been somewhat of a conflict between Brooklyn and the Bronx.
Yeah.
Because the Bronx is Yankees, and of course, the Brooklyn years ago was Dodgers, but now there are a lot of Met fans there.
Yeah.
So things used to be different, but now they've pretty much merged into one. Although a lot of neighborhoods have actually improved over the years, because the real estate values have gone up. So neighborhoods that I thought were in the decline, actually, I couldn't even afford to live there now.
Oh, wow.
I'll give you an example. There's a place in Brooklyn called Williamsburg, Brooklyn. Williamsburg, where my dad grew up, at one point in time was a very high-risk area. Now I couldn't even afford to buy a place there.
Wow. So it's moving on up then.
It's moving up.
Yeah. I want to take a minute to talk about sleep and recovery, which, as we all know, I've had a number of guests on that speak to the importance, and I know I can certainly attest to how important good sleep is, which is why I love Ghost Bed. Every mattress has a 20-year warranty. Some even have a 25. You can try it out for 101 nights. If you don't like it, you can send it back. No hard feelings. One of my favorite parts about Ghost Bed is that it has a cooling technology in it, which I can tell you from here in Texas in the summer times is crucial to not sweating your ass off at night. And so the cooling technology in conjunction with the warranty and the level of comfort really provide a one-stop shop for just a great night's sleep and a recoverful, restful sleep. Ghost Bed also offers bundles so that you can get really everything you need. You can choose from their 4 mattresses and then pick the bundle. So whether you just need a mattress and a frame or you want the whole package like the cooling pillows and sheets, you can get the best bang for your buck that way. Right now, Ghost Bed is offering 40% off the Ghost Bed bundles where you get a mattress and adjustable base. That's 40% off. Or 30% off everything if you use the code MicDrop, all caps, all one word, at ghostbed.com/MicDrop. You can buy a mattress for like $35 a month. They have 0% financing, 0 down plans for up to 60 months. Again, go check out ghostbed.com/MicDrop, all caps, all one word. Also, if you do have an RV or a camper, be sure to check out the Ghost Bed RV mattress. You can get all foam or hybrid versions, and it's perfectly sized to fit an RV, camper, trailer, etc. And it's way better than what you're sleeping on now with any of the other aftermarket stuff out there, or damn sure what is included from whatever RV manufacturer you got it from. And again, you can get 30% off the RV mattress by using the code MicDrop. So one last time, that's ghostbed.com/MicDrop. And that code again is MicDrop, all capitals, all one word. All right. So overall, I guess, so you grew up in New York. What was the kind of catalyst from, say, high school until you got involved? Like, what was your early graduating high school, going to college, and then that kind of path that led you into doing what you did?
Yeah, well, I always wanted to do investigative work. I think I was a product of watching too many Columbo television shows.
Yeah.
And I always loved him because, unlike the Dirty Harry type, which I'm obviously not, I liked Columbo because he was sort of a thinking man's investigator, and I would watch him and I say, I think I could do that. I could be like Columbo.
Yeah.
So I developed this fascination with him and in investigations. And so then when I went to college, and all of a sudden someone from the federal government came to visit us, and he said, "Hey, look, Bruce, you got to get into the federal government. It doesn't make a difference what job you take. I don't care if you're cleaning floors. Get into the government because you'll have that civil service status. Once you have that civil service status, it's a lot easier for other agencies to pick you up." So my first job was an Army Reserve technician. I had been in the Army Reserve, and there was an opportunity to be a civilian technician, which runs the Army Reserve unit during the week when the reserves are not meeting on the weekends. And I did that for 6 months, and I got that civil service status, which was so important to me. Both my parents had been civil service workers. My mother worked for the state. My father worked for the city. So they had drilled into me, "Hey, Bruce, you'll never be rich, but you'll always have a job. Yeah. You'll always have income. You'll always have health insurance." Oh, that sounds good to me. So I worked for 6 months as an Army Reserve technician, and then the opportunity came up to be an investigator for the Defense Department. And I started out doing background investigations on applicants for top secret security clearances. So you had to speak to their neighbors, their friends, their co-workers, their supervisors. It was a great way to begin learning how to be an investigator. And I'd recommend that for anyone who's interested in going into the investigative field, starting out doing background investigations. learning how to speak to people, learning how to listen, of course, which is very important, and to write. So I did that for a couple of years, and then my organization started doing DOD fraud cases. So then I became a fraud investigator for the Department of Defense, which was very interesting.
What would be some cases of that?
Well, I could tell you about one particular case that we had. It was a firm called the Bradford National Corporation. And Bradford National Corporation had a series of contracts with the government. Some were fixed price contracts, and some were what they referred to as cost plus fixed fee. So whatever the cost was associated with the contract, the government would reimburse them plus a fixed fee. So Bradford said, you know what? We're losing all this money on these fixed fee contracts that we have, but this cost plus fixed fee, we keep billing and billing and billing. So let's lie to the government and tell them that this work that we're actually doing on the fixed price contracts, we're not really, we're doing it on the fixed price contracts, but we're going to charge them on the cost plus fixed fee contracts. So the government is paying, in fact, it was the Trident submarine program that was actually paying for the writing of the New Jersey driver's manual. They were actually, I'm not kidding, they were actually paying to computerize the records of a large pharmaceutical company. And that was my first introduction into the world of fraud cases.
Wow.
And it was fascinating, and I really loved it. Well, then we had a president, Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter said, you know, I think every federal agency should have an Office of Inspector General. And the purpose of that Office of Inspector General is to ferret out fraud, waste, and abuse in a particular agency. So if you're in the Defense Department, they have an IG. If you're in Social Security, if you're in the VA, if you're in Health and Human Services, all these agencies now have inspector generals. And most inspector generals are separated into two different organizations. There's an Office of Audit, which has accountants and auditors, and they do as the name suggests. And there's also an Office of Investigation, and that's where I belonged. So I was with the VA Office of Inspector General Criminal Investigation Division. And we did all the internal criminal investigations for the VA, and I was in charge eventually for the entire Northeast. Now, what separated the VA OIG from other OIGs is we actually had a third component. And that third component was the Office of Healthcare Inspections. And these were doctors and nurses who actually visited the hospitals and conducted inspections to make sure that the hospitals were up to snuff.
So with all, I mean, I guess you can't speak to the other inspector generals of other departments, but I'm sure that there are even cases of bribery and scandal and fraud and stuff even within the IGs, right? I mean, like ultimately, you know, somebody, there's a last stand of people that are watching everybody else, right? That human beings are human beings. I mean, you know, power and money and corruption, whatever persists throughout all forms of everything. Did you run into cases where guys in your position were taking bribes or corrupt, or have you seen that?
No, honestly, no. And I'm not saying that it didn't happen. Yeah. But I personally did not see it.
I guess who is lining up, you know, like, so when Carter says, hey, I want IGs for all these departments, who's in charge of standing those up and finding those people? You know what I mean? Because like,
well, actually Congress and the inspector generals have a dual role. They report to the head of the agency, so they report to the head of the VA, and they also report to Congress, so they have dual reporting.
Okay.
But they're actually nominated by the president and approved by Congress, and most of them have a 10-year term. So it's a very, very important position. Now, the VA is one of the largest federal agencies, but the last time I looked, they had one of the smallest IGs. I don't know why that is, to tell you the truth. I really don't know, but it was a tremendous, tremendous amount of work. And each IG files an annual report. So if listeners just Google the annual report for the defense IG or VA IG or any IG they want, they will read about the audits and investigations that were conducted. And I think one of the reasons why I answer your question that I did not see any IG agents actually involved in that is that the money is in the agency itself. If you're a contracting officer, Mike, and you're responsible for millions of dollars of procurement, and I'm a contractor, I'm going to you. Yeah. And I'm going to try to bribe you. And this is true even in the private sector. When I left the VA and I worked for the private sector, the very first case I had in the private sector was a bribery case.
Really?
Yes. It actually involved an employee who was in charge of the boiler rooms. And a contractor wanted to get into the hospital system. Now, this hospital system that I worked at, they had 8 hospitals. So if I could service the boilers in 8 hospitals, that could change my life. It could make a big difference to me. So he goes to the head of the boiler room and he says, look, I got to get in here. What do you want? What do you need to get me in the hospital? And he says, $25,000 would do. He says, okay, but listen, the hospital requires 3 bids, so how are we going to get around it? And the contractor says, don't worry about that. I'll submit all 3 bids. I'll submit 1 real bid, and I'll make up 2 other bogus bids, submit them all, and when those dumb auditors come around and start looking, all they do is see if there are 3 bids. So they'll come around with their checklist and they'll go, 3 bids in the boiler room? Yes, 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 go on to the next. But we fooled them because when I got there, one of the first things I said, you know what we're going to do? Let's interview the losing bidders. Because the winning bidders, oh, they're going to tell us the hospital's great. But let's hear what the losing bidders have to say. So we went to look for the losing bidders, but we couldn't find them.
So they just make up names? Oh, wow.
And they made up stationery, and they'll look very legit. But these geniuses used the same fax machine to fax in all 3 bids. So it all came in on the same phone number.
Wow.
All right. So what happened was that the employee and the contractor both got arrested and prosecuted in the federal court. And you know what's the most terrible thing about all these cases? So let's say you're on the board of directors now, and you open up the New York Times. And when you open up the New York Times, you're not reading, oh, what a great hospital this is. Look how many lives they save. Look how compassionate they are. No, you're reading bribery at your hospital.
Yeah.
I mean, that's going to drive you crazy.
Yeah.
All right? And if you're on the board of directors, you're going to say, hey, what's going on in this hospital? We're allowing bribery here. We're allowing all these terrible things to happen.
Yeah.
So it's very hurtful to the management and the employees, but this is the world we live in, and it goes on all the time.
Is there a minimum from a penalty standpoint that those that the contractor in the bribery case received? Like, what was their punishment?
Well, you know, it's interesting you say that, because in the Justice Department there's a division called the Antitrust Division, and the Antitrust Division they actually handle a lot of these cases, believe it or not. And it depends, first of all, is the contractor going to plead guilty or if they're going to go to trial? If they're going to plead guilty, and if they've never been in trouble before, and if the dollar amount is not that large.
Which would be under what?
Well, it depends on the jurisdiction. It used to be $100,000. But it varies, because some U.S. Attorney's Office will still prosecute regardless of the dollar amount if they think there's a real message to be sent. But other U.S. Attorney's Offices that are so inundated with cases, they used to have a $100,000 minimum threshold. I don't even know what it is today. It might be $250,000.
Oh, wow.
You know.
So do you remember what, in that case that you spoke of, what their punishment was?
Yeah. The employee got 6 months in jail, and the contractor got a year in jail. And plus they had to return the $25,000, and there was a fine. And, the most important thing, though, was to send a message to our employees in the hospitals that, hey, we're looking.
Yeah.
Don't even think about doing this, because we're going to go around and we're going to check.
Yeah.
But what percentage of the actual fraud we uncovered, it's really difficult to say.
Yeah. It's kind of like, how many people do you catch at the border? It's like it's impossible to know, right? One thing I know, for most of the hard chargers out there that drink a lot of coffee throughout the day, is that one of the problems is anxiety, jitters, or that crash in the afternoon from drinking it. So that's why I started working with mud water. It's a coffee alternative with 4 adaptogenic mushrooms and herbs. It's got a fraction of the caffeine of a cup of coffee. So you get that same kind of energy boost and mental clarity without those jitters and anxiety and crash that you do with coffee. Each ingredient was added for a purpose. It's got cacao and chai for mood and a microdose of caffeine. It's got lion's mane for alertness, cordyceps to help support physical performance, chaga and reishi to support your immune system. It's got turmeric for soreness, and it's got cinnamon for antioxidants. It tastes great. From a favorite ingredient standpoint, I'm a big fan of the lion's mane for alertness. My day is pretty busy, and I have a lot to pay attention to and keep track of, and so that helps me out a lot. But again, there's a host of beneficial ingredients. I actually like to throw a little bit of monk fruit vanilla drops with just a little bit of heavy cream, and it gives me that kind of vanilla latte esque flavor to it. Mudwater is Whole30 approved. It's 100% USDA organic, non-GMO, gluten-free, vegan, and kosher certified. And one of the big things that I love about this company is that they donate monthly to the Berkeley Center for Science of Psychedelics, as Mudwater believes the country is in a mental health epidemic and sees psychedelics as useful tools for individuals with depression, PTSD, anxiety, and other mental health problems. That really strikes a chord with me as I see a lot of veteran communities that have benefited greatly from projects such as the Berkeley Center. So right now, Mudwater, which is mudwtr.com/Mike, to support both my show, and use the code Mike for 15% off your order at Mudwater. So again, that's Mudwater, mudwtr.com/Mike. And use just Mike, all caps, MIKE, for 15% off your total order, and try these amazing products out. Is there a biggest bribery case, dollar amount wise, that you can recall that you guys uncovered?
In the VA?
Yeah. Is there any landmark, holy shit, substantial amounts or really crazy?
Yeah, there probably are. It doesn't come to mind right now. But it's, like I say, bribery is just one crime in a smorgasbord of crimes that are out there, and a lot of contract fraud, where either the contractor is not performing, or the contractor just out and out lied, or the contractor is overbilling. I'll give you, for instance, hospitals do a lot of construction. Probably you see here as you drive by hospitals every couple of years, right? There's always a new wing going up or something like that. So hospitals will enter into these contracts, and the contractor will intentionally low bid because he knows that the hospital or the medical profession is going to always want to make changes. And change orders, as we refer to it, are always ripe for fraud, because you can have a contract where you negotiate all the prices, the labor rates, and everything of that nature. And then comes the change orders. And by the time the change orders come, the contractor will say, well, the labor rates have changed, the cost of material has changed. And what we find is that they overbill, double bill, and triple bill in the change orders. There's a famous photograph out there of a large ship with a small little boat connected to it. And the small boat is titled Main Contract.
Yeah.
And the large boat is titled Change Orders.
Yeah.
Because that's where the money came. When I was in the government and we were doing construction, for instance, one year they were constructing a new office for me. And they said, Bruce, you can't walk into that office until everything is done and we're done paying for it. Because they know the end user is going to come in and say, you know, I don't want a window here. I want a window there. I don't like the way this wall is. I want to move the bathroom to that side. Yeah. And that's what contractors love, which is okay if you're legitimate in your pricing. But if you're not legitimate in your pricing, it's not really okay.
So that's probably even good advice just for like if you're doing remodeling of your house, is the initial bid's always going to be lowballed so that they get it, and then it's everything you change after that. That's what you really want to scrutinize.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that was one of many. What were some other cases that you ran into?
Well, remember, hospitals have a lot of narcotics. And on occasion, we've had nurses or physicians who have actually stolen these narcotics, either to use for themselves, a family member, or on rare occasion to sell it out on the street. And this is particularly terrible because often what happens is that when the nurse or physician takes that narcotic has actually been prescribed for a patient who's not receiving it.
Yeah.
So if patient Mike is in a lot of pain and I'm supposed to give him painkillers, but I'm just giving him saline solution and I'm taking the painkillers myself, not only am I stealing the drugs from the hospital, but this poor patient is still in pain and still suffering.
Does that happen a lot?
It happens more than I'd like to see.
Yeah.
You know, I wouldn't say a lot, but it does happen, and it happens more and more because more and more people seem to be addicted to these narcotics, to these drugs. So it's a terrible thing. The last case I had when I was working in the private sector involved just that. It was a traveling nurse. Now, what traveling nurses are, particularly during COVID.
Yeah, I knew a few of them.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So listen, I mean, it's I just want to preface the rest of my remarks by saying that no one has more respect for the nursing profession than I do. I mean, you have to be smart, you have to be tough, you have to be compassionate. They are the most wonderful people I've ever dealt with. But in that universe of such wonderful people, on occasion, being human beings, there are people that either become addicted to drugs or do things that's opposed to their oath that they took to actually help people. So this was a traveling nurse. She was a traveling nurse from Kansas City. She came up to New York. She was actually in the emergency room, and she had access to narcotics, and she was taking narcotics and not giving it to the patients, but taking it for herself. And it was terrible because the patients, you know, they have something called the pain score, and they checked the patients to see if the pain score is improving. If I'm giving you narcotics to help you, then your pain score shouldn't be 10 anymore. It should be down to about 2 or 3, right? So they couldn't understand why the patient's pain scores weren't improving. And it turns out that this nurse, this traveling nurse, was actually taking the drugs for herself. Now, something interesting. So she admits to me, and this is during the height of COVID, she admits to me that she did this, that she took the drugs for herself. So I call up the New York City Special Narcotics Prosecutor, and I said, look, we have a nurse here, and this is what she did. And at the time, the prosecutor said, hey, Bruce, I don't have anybody to come help you. Half my staff is out with COVID, and the courts are closed. You're going to have to let her go.
Wow.
So we let her go. I don't know if she went to another hospital to do the same thing or not. Finally, a year later, justice caught up with her, and she was arrested and prosecuted. But during that period of time, I have no idea what happened to her.
Holy shit.
And you know what's interesting? When I started doing her background, I discovered that she had the same issue in Kansas City. But you know what the hospitals would tell you? Look, during COVID, we couldn't find staff.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like the enemy is coming over the hill. Do you have time to do a background investigation on every soldier you're going to put on the front line? I don't think so. You're just going to put them up there. So we were grabbing all these nurses from all around the country. And if we didn't do such a great background investigation, well, excuse me, you know, we were in the middle of a pandemic, a crisis here. Wow. And it was really a terrible story.
What were the drugs that she was taking?
Well, let me see now if I remember. I go back. I mean, I know there were definitely narcotics. You know, I just slipped my mind for the moment, but it'll come to me in a moment because there are so many drugs, you know, that are available. And she helped herself to more than one. That's why my mind is a little shady on that.
Is that typically how it's done, is that it'll be prescribed to a patient and they'll not give it to them but say that they did and just take them, as opposed to just stealing from an inventory standpoint?
Well, it's interesting because a number of these drugs are in something called the Pyxis C2 safe, a Pyxis machine. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It looks like a giant Pez dispenser for drugs, okay? And you put the code in, and a little drawer opens up, and the drawer opens up, and the drug is in there, and it's supposed to be on a doctor's orders. But what happens if there's no doctor around? What happens if there's an emergency? You know, and patient Mike is really screaming and suffering and I can't find a doctor. Well, I could go in with what they call an override, and then the doctor is supposed to follow up later. So I could go in with an override and open up that drawer and take that narcotic. Now, what a number of these nurses did is that the drawer would open up and then they would press cancel. So the system would think that the drug was returned in the drawer, but in fact, it wasn't returned in the drawer. They just took it out and kind of used it themselves. Eventually, the pharmacy would catch on. But I say eventually because, again, it would vary from pharmacy to pharmacy, department to department. So it would take a while for them actually to catch on.
Wow. That
there was drugs missing.
Do you know who's filling those machines?
Yeah, well, yeah, they're filled in the pharmacy.
Okay.
They come around, you know, and they fill up the machines. And there are new programs now, because this was such a problem, that monitor all kinds of drug usage. But even with these programs, some of the bad folks are pretty smart, and they're still able to circumvent it for a while. But look, if you have a habit, even if you think you're going to get caught eventually, you really don't care, because you have to put the grabbers on that drug right now for yourself.
Yeah.
And that, unfortunately, what happens. And then eventually they get caught. And then there was a big debate in the hospitals. Well, you know, Bruce, if nurses are taking these drugs for themselves, should they still be prosecuted? Or do you think they should just go into a drug treatment program? And my argument is, yeah, they should be prosecuted, because there's a patient that is being harmed, or at least potentially being harmed by this. And this was a big debate. I used to get a lot of pushback on that. They'd say, well, you know, if they're taking the drugs and they're selling the drugs, yes, I could see them prosecuted, but if they're using it for themselves. Now, in the private sector also, I had a case involving the director of pharmacy at one of the large hospitals in New York City. And this director of pharmacy stole 250,000 doses of oxycodone over 5 years.
Jesus.
All right? Over 5 years. And at first he told me he was taking it himself. I said, come on, if you were taking it yourself, you'd be dead now. Yeah. We wouldn't even be having this conversation.
Yeah.
This is what happened. They had two pharmacies in the hospital. First pharmacy is a general pharmacy. Second pharmacy is a research pharmacy. So he says to his staff, and now he's the director of pharmacy, so pay attention. Staff, we have a new study on oxycodone. It's a very, very important study. It's going into the research pharmacy, that small research pharmacy. So I, as director of the pharmacy, I'm going to do all the procurement, all right? And I'm going to watch those drugs when they come in, and I'm going to personally bring them down to the pharmacy, the research pharmacy. Of course, it's an important study. And this goes on. It's okay, boss. This goes on for years. All of a sudden, an anonymous letter shows up in my office. And it says, hey, Bruce, something's going on with oxycodone. We don't know what, but we're ordering a shitload of it, and we don't know what's going on with it. So I go visit the director of pharmacy, okay? And I say, Mr. Director, you know, we got this anonymous letter. I don't really know if it means anything, you know, but they're questioning how much oxycodone we're ordering. I said, what's going on here? He says, oh, don't worry about this, Bruce. He says, there's a special study. There's a special study for oxycodone, and I'm doing all the ordering, and I'm on top of it. Everything's legit. His name was Anthony. I said, Anthony, thank you very much. You know, I really appreciate that, but can I see the study? Because if I go back to my boss and just tell him that, he's going to say, Bruce, where's the study? We want to see the study. So he says, it's in storage. Come back in a week. Okay, I'm not going anywhere. Come back in a week. Okay, Anthony, I'm ready. Show me the research program. Well, there really wasn't a research program, and I've really been taking the drugs myself, you know. And at that point, Mike, this guy was a huge weightlifting guy. And pharmacies are usually like second thoughts when they build hospitals. They put them away in some small little place. So this guy had his own small office, and the window was open, and I thought the guy was going to jump right out. I really thought he was going to jump right out. Now, with me happened to be the director of pharmacy for the entire network. And she's listening to him say this, and she's like sliding back in the chair. I thought she was going to fall on the floor. Well, how much have you taken, Anthony? I've taken a lot. So we did an audit, and it was 250,000 oxycodone pills. Now, there were so many pills that with that amount, he could have actually gotten the death penalty under the drug kingpin statute.
Holy shit.
Believe it or not.
Wow.
This case made headlines as far away as Australia. Somebody called me up and said, Bruce, there's a newspaper in Australia about this case. Because whoever heard of a pharmacist stealing 250,000 doses of oxycodone? So what happened to it? Well, he wasn't really taking it. He was selling it to guys in Staten Island that we describe as having like short fingers and fat necks. You know what I mean? So that's who he was selling it to. And then he actually became a government witness. So he got like 5 years in jail. But the difference between an internal investigator and even an IG investigator and your traditional law enforcement is, if I was the FBI, and let's say I did this case, I was the FBI, as soon as Anthony got locked up, my job would be over. But when you're in the Inspector General or you're an internal investigator, your job is only half done. Because now you have to go back in the system and you have to work with the folks to change the system to prevent something like that from ever happening again. Because if you're on the board of directors of the hospital and I come to you and I explain this case like this, you're going to say, hey, Bruce, that's very good. How do we know this is not going on in our 7 other hospitals? What systems do we have in place to prevent this from happening in our other hospitals?
Yeah.
And that's where a very large part of my work was as well. Not only putting the grabbers on the bad guy or girl, but also working with people in the system to make it a much better system.
So would you just put checks and balances in place? Like if you're ordering, there has to be 2 people accounting for it?
Well, there are a lot of checks and balances, and there are a lot of IT systems that we developed, and cameras, and a whole list of things. But also what we did is we went around to the staff and we talked to the staff about the problem of drug diversion, right? And how we're watching. We didn't give away all our secrets, but they got the message, all right? And how the management had zero tolerance for this. And if you engage in this, we're going to get you arrested and we're going to get you prosecuted.
Do you have any idea what the street value was of what that guy stole?
Yeah. It was an incredible amount of money. And if somebody Googles, it was millions of dollars.
Wow.
It was millions of dollars. And that was why he could have been sentenced under the drug kingpin statute.
Yeah.
But he wasn't.
Yeah, man. You said guy or girl. What's the percentage from your just kind of off the cuff perspective, male versus female perpetrators of all the different things that you've come across?
Well, now that we're in the world of equal rights,
yeah,
I could tell you that there are equal rights among women and men perpetrators. Now, when I first started, most of my perpetrators were male.
Yeah.
But since women have matured into all these executive positions and contracting positions, well, they've turned out to be just as corrupt as the men.
Well, yeah, I mean, power corrupts, right?
Yeah, so I would say it's
pretty split.
It's pretty much across the board.
Wow. All right, so you got fraud, bribery, and drug cases now moving into, not that those aren't serious, but the even more serious where it's actual murdering in healthcare.
Yeah.
How does somebody in your position or just kind of the official position of the Inspector General office as an entity differentiate or separate the difference between what's just malpractice and or carelessness basically versus intent?
Yeah, and the defense often used is that there was no intent to kill, but it really varies based on the facts of the particular case. And as I go through some of these cases, you'll see that these cases are not Kevorkian, these cases are not malpractice, these cases are intent. And one of the first red flags, by the way, is that the victims of these crimes were not expected to expire when they did. So look, if you ever had a loved one in the hospital and they were very sick and the staff knew that chances are the patient was going to expire and the family knew, so death wasn't really a shock. But in these particular cases, many times it's just the opposite. The patient is actually improving. The family goes on vacation saying, oh, we could come back and visit Dad. Look, he looks so much better. Only to get a phone call that Dad had expired unexpectedly. And when you have this series of unexpected deaths, that's what starts to bring us into the world of intent, into the world that is something really different than just a malpractice situation here.
So in most of these cases, they were uncovered, caught, identified because it was happening over and over.
Yeah, and that's one of the terrible things about the world of medical serial killers, because when you speak about your traditional serial killers, you talk about 4 or 5 deaths. Well, they're actually amateurs compared to my medical serial killers. Many of them have killed 30, 60, 100, 150 people.
Jesus Christ.
And the reason why, well, there are a number of reasons why, actually. But first of all, ask yourself this question, Mike. If you're so inclined to commit a series of murders, what profession and what location might you choose? Well, first of all, you want to choose a location where death is a common everyday occurrence, right? If people die in a hospital, is that news? If people die in a nursing home, is that news? No. And then you want to work with a group of people that have taken an oath to protect and serve and save lives. Doctors take that Hippocratic oath. Nurses take something called the Florence Nightingale oath. And the overwhelming majority of these medical professionals are just the most honest, hardworking, dedicated people. I've met some of the most compassionate healthcare people. Not only are they compassionate to people, after they leave the jobs, they're compassionate to animals as well. They're just a wonderful group of people. So if you're going to hide in a group and you want to kill people, well, if you hide in an outlaw motorcycle gang or organized crime, that's not really hiding, is it? Yeah. But if you hide in a group of people so dedicated to save lives, who's going to actually think that you're intentionally taking lives?
Yeah.
All right. So next thing you want to do is pick a profession where the public trusts you implicitly. Listen to that police officer, sweetheart. Listen to that nurse. They have your best interest in mind. And of course, 99.9% of the time, they do have your best interest in mind. Okay. Then you want to work in a location where the police are really reluctant to come in and investigate. You know, look, most cops, myself included, most cops don't become cops because we're good in chemistry and biology, okay? So we're very easily intimidated by the science, very easily. And not only the science, but there's this law, you know, in the hospital, this HIPAA law, this Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. What records can I get with a subpoena? What records do I need a court order for? Can I get all the records, or there's some records that I can't get? Where are the records stored? Who do I talk to? You know, it's this hospital world I find very, very, very confusing. And then you have the whole issue of how difficult it is for management to accept the fact that some employee in this wonderful universe of healthcare givers is actually intentionally taking a life. It's very, very difficult for them to manage. And not only is it difficult for them, like emotionally, but also from a management standpoint. Look, if you're the director of the hospital, do you want the word to get out in public that you had an employee here that was intentionally murdering people? Of course not. That's the last thing you want. So how do most of these cases come to the surface? They don't really come to the surface because of audits or electronic watching or anything like that. They come to the surface because of brave whistleblowers, nurses and doctors who see something and are not afraid to say something. And it usually goes this route, Mike. It starts like this. They'll go to the management and they'll say, management, every time Nurse Bruce is on duty, the death rate goes up. Nurse Bruce takes a vacation, the death rate goes down. And management say, so? What does that mean? Maybe Bruce has the most complex cases. Maybe it's a statistical anomaly. Maybe there is some reason behind it. What are you saying? Did you actually see Bruce kill anybody? Well, no, I didn't actually see Bruce kill anybody. But what happens is that he goes in the room and he takes that curtain and he puts that curtain behind him and the patient. And sometimes later, the patient dies unexpectedly. And we didn't even expect these patients to die. Oh, I see. Now, so you didn't actually see Bruce kill anybody, did you? No. I want to ask you a question about yourself, nurse. If we drug tested you right now, are you going to turn up positive? Is your license up to snuff? Is all your training up to snuff? The reason why I ask this is because if you're going to make these allegations, then you yourself are sort of the subject of investigation as well. Are you sure you want to go through with this? You sure you just don't want to, go back to your little job and be quiet? And you know what, nurse? Did you ever hear this story about, there was a hospital in New Jersey that had a medical serial killer. And you know what happened to that hospital? They changed their name 3 times and they still had to go out of business. Do you want that to happen here? Do you want us to go out of business here? Well, that'll deter some whistleblowers, but some will, be strong and fight on, even though their own particular backgrounds may be imperfect.
Yeah.
All right? So then management says this. They say, okay, Nurse Mike, just for you, this is what we're going to do. We're going to appoint a board of our very best doctors and nurses, and we'll have them review these cases, Nurse Bruce's cases, and we'll get back to you. So who's on this board? All employees of the hospital. All employees with a vested interest to keep the hospital going. Nobody trained in forensics. nobody from the outside. And then they call the nurse back and they say, nurse, you know, we took this matter very seriously. So we appointed our board of our very, very best physicians and nurses. And you know what? They made a determination that all these patients expired as a direct result of their natural disease processes. Look, they have so much wrong with them that it's pretty reasonable to think that any one of these things would have killed them. When I looked at my first medical record at the VA, the medical record before electronic medical records was like this thick. I said, oh my God, I didn't know you could be alive and have this much wrong with you, and now I have to prove this guy was murdered?
Yeah.
It seemed like impossible to me. And then you know what else, nurse? Sometimes, and we do this on rare occasions in hospitals, but you know, we even did an autopsy. Now, an hospital autopsy is not the same as a forensic autopsy. A hospital autopsy is more of like a confirmatory autopsy. Could the patient have died from one or more of his underlying disease processes? Yes. Case closed. Okay. And the death certificate, if you look at the death certificate, well, they all kind of read pretty similar. You know, myocardial infarction or some kind of heart ailment. So now this is what we have, nurse. We did some autopsies. We did the medical review. We did all of our homework. Sorry, you know, we don't see anything. But some of these whistleblowers say, we're not buying that. We're not buying that for 1 minute. So they will reach out to the Inspector General at the VA, which is how I got involved in this, or they will reach out to law enforcement, and they are taking quite a chance. You know, there's a famous story right here in Texas. Right here in Texas, there were 2 nurses in a place called Kermit, Texas, which is in the oil basin somewhere. And these 2 nurses were the entire compliance department of the hospital, small hospital. And these 2 nurses says, you know, this doctor here, we think he's intentionally harming people. Let's go to management and tell them. So they go to management, and management says, hey, nurse, you know how hard it is to find doctors in Kermit, Texas? Why, we have to go all the way to the Philippines, or we go to Ireland. So you know what? Unless you have a lot more evidence that this doctor's intentionally harming people, why don't you just go back to your office and be quiet, okay? So these nurses say, well, wait a minute. Well, we're not going to do that. What do we do now? So nurse says, I have an idea. Let's send an anonymous letter to Texas state officials, an anonymous letter, okay? And we're going to complain about this doctor and list all our complaints. Well, the doctor gets wind of this, and boy, is he pissed. So he calls up one of his patients, who happens to be the local sheriff, guy named Robert Roberts, and he says, Sheriff Roberts, I think these 2 nurses are intentionally trying to harm my reputation. And the sheriff says, don't worry, Doc, I'm on the case. He gets a search warrant for their hospital computers and determines that they were the authors of the anonymous letter to the state. Actually has them arrested and prosecuted for misuse of official information, which is a felony in those parts. These nurses get fired. They can't find work anymore. They have to hire their own attorneys. So what happens? The case goes to trial. The jury's out for about 20 minutes, and they come back and they say, are you kidding me? These nurses deserve a medal for what they did, not to be criminally prosecuted. But what kind of message, Mike, does that send out to other whistleblowers around the system? Yeah. They say, hey, you hear about those 2 nurses in Texas? Did you hear what happened to them? I don't want to go through what they did. You know, we're just going to keep our mouth shut, and we're not going to say anything. So with that kind of background, then eventually law enforcement will show up at the hospital, and they'll meet the director of the hospital, well, someone like me, and they'll say, well, thank you very much, officer, for coming. We appreciate your concerns. And, you know, we were just as concerned as you were. So you know what we did? We appointed a board of our very best doctors and nurses. Sometimes we even did an autopsy. We reviewed the medical records. We looked at the death certificates. And in this report, we've determined that all the patients expired as a direct result of their natural disease processes. Now, how many police departments are going to continue to pursue the matter after that? Not many. Not many, because first of all, they don't have the resources, and they have a load of other cases, and they're going to say, thank you very much, Mr. Director. I'm going to take this report. I'm going to put it in a file. Case closed. Done. And that's why medical serial killers get away with killing so many people until they're prosecuted.
So I'm assuming, based off of what you said, then, that there are actually people that go into that field for the specific reason of murdering people? Like,
you know what? I think that's a very tiny minority of my medical serial killers. I think I ran into one at the VA, yes. I think a number of them don't initially go in, but something happens in their life, either a divorce, or they become involved in narcotics themselves, or something happens that just kind of alters their whole view of life and view what they're doing. So I don't think most of them go in that field, but I think there are some, and I met one who actually did go in the field.
Did he admit to doing that, or how did you prove that? Or how did that come about?
Did he admit to going into the field? No.
I mean, so how do you ascertain that from?
It begins with their background. You know, many of them have backgrounds where they were in trouble all their lives, where they were starting fires, they were harming animals, they were just really, really bad people looking for the next adventure, the next bit of excitement. That's pretty rare, but not totally uncommon, but pretty rare. I think the majority of them that I've dealt with really started out with the best of intentions. Some of them actually worked for years without a problem, and then something happened and they started killing people.
In those cases where it's a transformation process, was there any research or follow-up studies that kind of concluded that there was a pattern or like a catalyst that was common, you know, whether it was divorce and then further, was there a typical target, or was it just was there a pattern, a mold, or was it just all over the place?
Well, you know, when I was on the job, we used to refer to these as the Silence of the Lambs guys. Yeah. The guys who would sit around and study this and all. But I could tell you what I've seen with over 20 years plus of doing these cases is this. The number one reason that I saw is something called Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Now, Munchausen syndrome by proxy, an example of that was a mother that may intentionally harm a child, bring that child in the hospital to show the hospital what a caring, loving parent they are, to bring attention to themselves, okay? Many of my serial killers, when you look in their job evaluations, you see they're like, okay, nurses, except when it came to a code being a cardiac arrest, and the crash carts come and people come running in. It's a very, very exciting event. And these people loved the excitement of the code. It gave them a chance to show the staff what outstanding nurses they are, what wonderful skills they have, how caring they are during a code. Of course, they caused the code to begin with, just like a fireman who maybe burns down the firehouse. You know, it's a similar thing. So this Munchausen syndrome by proxy is very, very common. I had a case, there's a case in the book on a woman named Kristen Gilbert. Kristen Gilbert, the doctors and nurses in the hospital used to say, you know, if I ever coded, I would want Kristen Gilbert to be there. She comes running in. She takes charge. She starts barking orders to the young interns who are scared out of their mind. She's really terrific because she loved and craved that excitement, finally getting all this attention that they never really got in their lives. And there are a number of cases like this throughout the world. I mean, Kristen Gilbert is just one example. There are many examples. So I would say that what I've seen, a very common reason, is this Munchausen syndrome by proxy. The second one is just having the power of life and death over an individual. Many of these people years later will say, you know, for years, everyone controlled me. I had no control over my life. Now I'm in control. There was a medical serial killer named Donald Harvey. And Donald Harvey said exactly that. He said, for the first number of years of my life, everybody told me what to do. I had no control. Now, all of a sudden, I had all the control. And he says, after I killed the first 15,
Jesus.
Excuse me, the first 15, and nobody even questioned me, he says, I thought I was ordained by God himself to do this. Well, you know what? It's not that illogical. If you kill 15 people and nobody even questions you, maybe you would start to think crazy things like that.
Yeah.
You know, so for a lot of people, it's the power of life and death, that ultimate power they never had in their lives. Now all of a sudden they have power. They were told what to do by their parents, by their spouse, by their teachers. Now all of a sudden they had the power. That's pretty powerful.
Sure.
Motivation.
It's like the Amish kid that goes to New York City when they're 18 and just loses their fucking mind. Was there a typical target, or was it target of opportunity?
Well, for many of them, it was a target of opportunity, but not for all. Some, many of them just kept their murder into the hospital, particularly in the ICU, the intensive care unit, where people are very, very sick, and death is not unexpected. And many of them used to like to work what we call the graveyard shift at 3 a.m. in the morning. Because if you've been in the hospital at 3 a.m. in the morning, there's usually not that much activity going on. The family's not there. So that is a perfect opportunity to take people out if you're going to take them out. And many of them actually wanted to work that graveyard shift, as they call it, because they weren't being watched.
Yeah.
But a number of them also attempted to kill on the outside. They attempted to kill their spouse. They attempted to kill their landlord. I mean, some of them, one case, he actually was poisoning his fiance.
Holy shit. Is that, was there a few common methodologies that were used? Was it usually poisoning or what?
Well, all right, ask yourself this. So now you're in the hospital, Mike, and you want to kill somebody. So do you have to bring in a knife or a gun? Well, there's no need to do that because the hospital has so many death-dealing chemicals right there, particularly on the crash cart. And remember, in the crash cart, you don't have time to carefully document everything you're taking. You're putting the Grabbus on it, and you're injecting the patient to save lives, okay? And a number of these drugs are still untraceable, particularly in embalmed tissue. So it's very, very difficult to prove that these particular patients were murdered by these drugs, because by the time the cops come, and let's talk a little bit about the crime scene, okay? So all of a sudden, a number of patients have expired unexpectedly, and the investigation begins. Well, where are these patients? They're all dead and buried, right? And what does this crime scene look like? Does it look like Columbo's crime scene with the body?
It's been cleaned up 45 times since then. Yeah.
It's been scrubbed to surgical standards, Mike. Yeah. Surgical standards. So where the heck is your evidence now? Yeah. Okay? Now, there are places to look, if you know where to look, particularly in the world of electronics, because nowadays people are hooked up to every known device science can produce, and some of them have records. Okay, but more than likely, the victims have been buried. And that requires an exhumation, and that requires toxicology. And sometimes the toxicology can work, but there are some substances that toxicology could still not pinpoint in embalmed tissue. And I had an example of that. Okay, in the Kristen Gilbert case, we had to exhume a number of bodies, and I asked the lab, are you going to be able to find out what the cause of death is? And they said, Bruce, don't worry. We have this brand new machine. It's called the High Performance Liquid Chromatography Tandem Mass Spectrometer. Holy cow. How does it work? Yeah, Bruce, you wouldn't understand. You couldn't understand.
Bend over, I'll show you. Yeah.
So, you know what? It looks sort of like something Willy Wonka. You know, put a little sample in and it goes around.
Yeah.
It came out, epinephrine. Fantastic. All right. Epinephrine is adrenaline. It speeds up the heart. And we had a lot of other evidence that pinpointed to her using epinephrine. So we were very happy. Then we were about to go to trial. The phone rings. It's the lab. I pick up the phone. They say, hey, sorry, Bruce, we made a mistake. We can't really show that there's epinephrine in the embalmed tissue, but have a nice trial. Well, what the hell do we do now? Well, we were able to show that the deaths were consistent with epinephrine poisoning, even though we didn't actually have the toxicology. And that case lasted 6 months, day after day, in federal court for 6 months, and then she was eventually found guilty. Now, interesting, that was a death penalty case in a state that doesn't have the death penalty. So how'd that happen? Because the crime occurred on federal property, the federal law took place, and the federal government has a death penalty. So there's a separate trial. One trial to determine guilt or innocence, and then a second sort of mini trial to determine whether the death penalty would be appropriate or not. And in this case, the jury said no death penalty, but she was sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. Now, something interesting about a number of these people, Mike, we talk about how they crave attention, you know, when there's a code. Some of them even craved media attention. Oh, this one Dr. Swango, he went in front of 2020 and a whole bunch of television shows to proclaim his innocence. Kristen Gilbert at the trial, every day she couldn't wait for the morning newspaper to read about herself.
Did she maintain her innocence, or did she?
She did maintain her innocence throughout the whole thing.
Even today, she still says.
Yeah. Well, she's not talking now because, you know, there were so many. This is what happens. If you have a number of suspicious deaths, and the number could be really horrific, you have to zero in on the very best cases. So even though we may have suspected her of killing 30 of our nation's heroes, we narrowed it down to about 3 or 4 of the very best cases. So if she was to talk and mention a case that we didn't try, she could be retried and actually get the death penalty. So she's not talking.
Okay. Is there any chance, just playing devil's advocate, that that any of the people that went through this process and ended up being found guilty, that it was just a bunch of unfortunate circumstances? Or, I mean, is that totally not possible?
Well, there have been one or two cases where medical serial killers have been either acquitted or the decision overturned. You know, the first VA case involving medical serial killers was in Ann Arbor, Michigan in 1975. There were 2 Filipino nurses who were accused of murdering patients with Pavulon, and they were actually found guilty, and then a nurse manager confessed, and their guilty plea was overturned. So somebody killed them. Was it the nurse manager who confessed? It could be. But there have been other cases around the world. There was a case about a nurse in Italy recently. A nurse in Italy was accused of killing 30 patients. And what she would do is take a selfie of herself and the victim.
Jesus.
All right.
That's creepy as fuck.
And but she was actually acquitted because they didn't have the toxicology. So she was actually acquitted. So sometimes people get acquitted, but most of the time they're actually found guilty. So I feel very good about the cases that I was involved with.
Yeah.
But there are times when it's actually impossible to prove.
So I guess from your perspective and standpoint, is there ever a difficulty in maintaining objectivity where, you know, like you've got proof, like you have it, but you don't have it, you know, like at what point, or is there a point for you where you're convinced that they're guilty and now you're trying to prove it? Or is it always trying to maintain a Switzerland fence riding level of objectivity, because to me that would be difficult. I mean, there's just like with, you know, many criminal or trial attorneys that their thing is, you know, what's your rate of conviction. So like it gets to a point where it's not even about whether or not that person is guilty. It's I want to try to nail him because now my conviction rate is maintaining that 97%, and I look like the superhero or whatever. I guess my question is that how do you navigate that in that position of saying like, yeah, I'm staying objective, or do you get to a point in some cases where like, I know this motherfucker is guilty, and how do you
yeah, it
reconcile
definitely
that?
It gets to that point. I think what helps is that when I approach these cases, I try to approach it also from the defense standpoint. So if I'm defending this nurse or doctor, what am I looking for? All right. What kind of defenses are they going to come up with? And if I could counteract all these defenses, then I feel good when we pursue the prosecution. So I try to look at it in any case that I had. I always try to play defense attorney and say, okay, well, you're saying that he stole this, but I'm going to argue this, this, and this. And then I could counteract that argument. And when I get to that point where I feel really good that I've counteracted all of their defenses, then I feel good about pursuing the case.
Okay. So that's kind of your own internal check and balance, yes, if you're doing the right thing, basically. Because I can only imagine is that, you know, case after case, if you get jaded to the point where it almost seems like everyone you come across, you're trying to prove them guilty, is that objectivity kind of starts to remove itself at a certain point. And that could be difficult. Did you come across cases where at first it seemed like they were guilty, and it was like, no, I think this is just coincidental circumstance or what have you? Or
not in the world of suspicious deaths, but certainly in the fraud and theft world and drug diversion world. Yeah, absolutely. So
on the suspicious death front, pretty much if you're there, there's a really good reason that you're there. And then like if you're there, it's to the point where it's almost obvious.
Well, look, the way we find out about it is from the whistleblowers who have reported multiple deaths. There was a case in Italy recently where there were 14 deaths, and management said, well, that's probably a statistical anomaly. Well, how would you like to be a statistical anomaly?
One of 14. How can there be 14 anomalies?
So the police get called after they finally, you know, take a look at 14 cases, and the numbers, like I say, throughout the world are really horrific. Now, something interesting actually going on in Germany, because, you know, a number of these medical serial killers go from hospital to hospital to hospital. So the first hospital, they say, well, you know, we kind of suspected something. Sometimes they even do a pretty good internal investigation, but when that employee moves on to the next hospital, they're so happy that they moved on. They don't call the police. And they certainly don't say anything to the second hospital because they'll never hire this guy. So we're just going to keep it quiet. And there's been a number of cases like this. There's a nurse, Charles Cullen. Charles Cullen worked in a number of hospitals in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. When Hospital A suspected something, they didn't say anything to Hospital B. That didn't say anything to Hospital C. That didn't say anything to Hospital D. And sometimes they actually did a very thorough internal investigation, but they didn't say a word when that person moved on. And interestingly, and very troubling, when the police finally got involved, these hospitals did not want to turn over their internal investigations even to the police.
For fear of just looking bad, of missing it?
That's right. So troubling. So now in Germany, where there's a medical serial killer, Munchausen syndrome by proxy, named Hogel, all right? Hogel admitted to killing over 100 patients, but the German police feel he killed about 300 patients, and he went from hospital to hospital to hospital. But for the first time, I think, anywhere in the world, managers who actually suspected something but didn't say anything to the next hospital got criminally charged with aiding and abetting these murders.
Wow.
Now, are they going to be convicted? I don't know, because the trial is going on right now as we speak, and the law in Germany is not the same as the law in the United States.
Yeah.
But that is fascinating, and I really hope something positive comes out of that, because that's the kind of message we need to send. Because throughout the United States, and actually throughout the world, I cannot conjure up one example of a manager being prosecuted who suspected something, even sort of detailed something, but didn't report it or didn't say anything. That's terrible.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, to me, that's the one missing link accountability-wise that I think would make a significant change. In most cases that you were involved in, was the mode of killing poisoning, or was it? That so almost always it's...
Well, ask yourself this: what's the definition of poisoning? The definition of poisoning is too much of anything. I mean, you could have too much water and be poisoned. Hydro poisoning, ain't too much poisoning. So many times they would either give an overdose of a particular drug that a patient was prescribed, or use another drug. But poisoning by definition is non-confrontational. It's not like two people had yelling and screaming at each other and throwing chairs, and the next thing you know, they poison one another. No, poisoning is a very quiet, non-confrontational form of murder, perfect for the hospital setting. So nobody could say, oh, that nurse was yelling at the patient, they were yelling at each other. No, nothing like that. Yeah. It's a very quiet form of murder, perfect for a hospital setting.
Did you find that any of these cases where there were serial murders in these hospitals, I guess specifically the VA that you were involved with, where the patients were profiled a certain way, where like they only went after men or women or certain races or certain ages, or was there ever any serial murders that went about their business that way?
Well, in Italy, that nurse who took the selfie, she would go after patients who rang that buzzer too much.
Oh, really?
You know, you can't keep ringing that buzzer and ringing that buzzer. And she would say to staff, I'll take care of that patient. Yeah. They're not going to be ringing that buzzer anymore. But usually, you know, it's patients, and particularly I saw this, not always, but sometimes at the VA. You know, the VA had a number of elderly patients. Back then, we still had World War II Korean vets. And sometimes the family would visit them often. Sometimes the family would never come. So if you have a patient and there's no family and there's nobody really watching him, being with him, that makes a really good target. And we see that particularly in nursing homes as well. You know, if there are no visitors, if nobody seems to care, if the patient is by themselves, it makes it a lot easier to take somebody out.
Are in any of those cases, from a defense standpoint, is the empathy card used of saying, like, I was put, like, this person was miserable, they had no family? Like, was that ever used as an angle to try to justify what they had done?
No, usually it was the patient was suffering so much that we wanted to put them out of their misery.
Yeah.
You know, I had an interesting case actually in Rhode Island, not a medical serial killer, but a suspicious death. And this is what happened. There's a patient, and the doctor says, I think this patient lived long enough, and took him out. And the nurse says, what are you talking about? Well, he's suffering and all. And she said, you just can't take him out. Yeah. You're not God. You just can't take him. Well, I think he suffered enough. So we got called. Now, it's interesting because the family didn't think that, and the family actually sued the doctor. And so we got called in, and I brought the case to the U.S. attorney in Rhode Island, and I said, here's a statement from a medical ethicist from Harvard. She agrees with us that this doctor committed murder. What gives him the right to take somebody out because he feels it's just time for that person to go? And the U.S. attorney declined the case. She declined the case. So I did something I used to teach my young agents never do. I used to teach at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. I used to teach this course on how to refer cases to the U.S. attorney. And the one thing I used to teach them, I said, if you got a declination, if the U.S. attorney declined the case, do not appeal. Do not, just say thank you and leave. Well, I did something that I always preached I shouldn't do. And I went to Main Justice in Washington, D.C., and I said, listen, I have statements here from the medical examiner that it's murder. I have a medical ethicist that says it's murder. I think this doctor should be prosecuted for murder. Okay, Bruce, we'll send the team down. Sent the team down. They said, well, we see your point, but we're not going to overturn the decision of the local U.S. attorney. So the entire thing was a big waste of time. And, of course, she would never take a case from me again if my life depended on it. But I felt so strongly, Mike, I really felt so strongly that this doctor should have been prosecuted. Well, he got sued and he had to pay money and the hospital had to pay money. But it was more than that.
Yeah,
it was more than that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
In those declination cases, is there amplifying info as to why, or do they just say, no, I'm not doing it?
Well, they say that often they say they don't think they could win a trial. All right, that's pretty common. You know, they don't think we could win a trial. It's too gray. We're not sure, you know. The doctor may produce defenses that would not enable us to win. But I was prepared. And it wasn't the first time that I've had cases decline, but it was the first time that I appealed the declination and lost.
Yeah, which is hence your advice, right? Of all the cases that you were involved in, is there one, which one was the highest body count?
Okay, well, my personal one was Michael Swango, and this is how this case came to me. So I'm sitting in my office, handling all these other cases that we spoke about, not even thinking about suspicious deaths. And all of a sudden, I get a call from the chief of psychiatry at the Northport, Long Island VA Medical Center, and she says, Bruce, you're not going to believe this, but we actually have a doctor working here who spent time in prison for poisoning his coworkers. So I look at the phone, Mike, and I'm saying, is this like a joke? Is this like an April Fool's? Let me check the calendar. Is this like an April Fool's joke? I mean, how could somebody pass a government background investigation, spend time in jail for poisoning his coworkers, and become a doctor in a VA hospital? Seems impossible. Well, I was wrong. Of course, I didn't think in the United States of America you could spend time in prison for poisoning people and come out and be a physician, but I was wrong. And that's when I got introduced to this Dr. Michael Swango. Now, Dr. Michael Swango, ex-Marine, by the way, when he was in medical school, he was known as 00 Swango, licensed to kill. Even his fellow students suspected him of murdering patients. They couldn't prove it. So they went to the dean and they said, hey, Dean, I don't think this guy Swango should be a doctor. And the dean said, what do you know? You're only students. I'm the dean. Yeah. Of course he should be a doctor. He needs a little bit more training. So he gets some more training, and he goes to Ohio State University Medical Center, an excellent medical center. And next thing you know, he's visiting patients, and this is a young girl, a young gymnast. Her name was Cynthia McGee. Cynthia McGee gets in a car accident with another student on campus, and she's actually improving until she gets a visit from Dr. Michael Swango. Then she dies unexpectedly. But Swango doesn't get charged with the murder. Who gets charged with the murder? The student that hit her with his car. He gets charged with vehicular homicide.
Wow.
But he didn't kill Cynthia McGee. Next thing you know, patients are dying unexpectedly at Ohio State University. They can't prove it. They suspect something. They can't prove it. Well, they say, we're not going to renew his internship. So he leaves, and he goes to what was really in many ways his first love, being an emergency medical technician, because he loved the excitement. He loved the excitement of pulling up to an emergency. He said, oh, I wish there were like multiple bodies. You know, this is really my chance to shine. And he was a really good EMT. And one day he invites his fellow EMTs in for some donuts. He says, hey, guys, you work so hard. Have some donuts on me. And they have the donuts, and they go home, and they all get very, very sick. And Michael Swango's calling them up. Tell me your symptoms. Tell me everything that happened to you. Give me all the details. This is his second opportunity to enjoy what he did. The first opportunity is when he actually sprinkled some poison, arsenic, on the donuts. The second one is actually hearing how they suffered. Well, these EMTs were not stupid. About 2 weeks later, Mike Swango comes around with a whole bunch of iced tea. Hey, guys, I made this wonderful iced tea for you. Why don't you have some?
You first, Dick.
So that's essentially what they said. They had the iced tea tested. It was loaded with arsenic. The cops did a great job. They went to his house. They found arsenic. They found books on poisoning. They found everything. He gets sentenced to 3 years in jail for poisoning his coworkers. Like I said, I didn't think you could come out and become a doctor again. But when you're a sociopath, psychopath, whatever path you want to use for him, he was very, very charming. And he actually convinced people that he had only spent 6 months in jail because he was a tough ex-Marine. He got in a barroom brawl. But here's a piece of paper. You see, the governor of the state has restored my civil rights. Here it is right here. And they'd say, great, we need doctors. Come on in. Next thing you know, he's working in a VA hospital on the West Coast. He's doing good. He's actually doing good. He meets a VA nurse. They get engaged. Everything seems fine. Then all of a sudden, the news story comes out, Mike, that he spent time in prison for poisoning his coworkers. That didn't go over very well in the community or with his fiance. So he breaks up with his fiance. He has to leave. And his fiance goes home. She goes back to Virginia. Her name was Kristen Kinney, just a beautiful young lady. And she says, you know, Mom, when I was living with Michael Swango, I used to get all these headaches. But they seem to be better now that I'm away from Mike. Well, about a month or two later, the doorbell rings, and it's charming Mike Swango. And he charms his way back into her life, and the headaches come back. And then she says, you know, Mom and Dad, I can't take this anymore. I can't take the headaches. I loved Mike, but I just can't take this anymore. So she goes to the park, and she takes out a gun, and she blows her brains out. Well, you can't blame Swango for that, can you? Well, actually, you can. Because even though her body was cremated, the family kept a lock of her hair, and we had the hair tested. It was loaded with arsenic. Swango was even poisoning his own fiancée. Well, to make a long story short, he winds up in my neighborhood, Northport, Long Island. Now, how did he get there? He got a residency at Stony Brook University on Long Island, which has a teaching arrangement with the VA hospital in Northport. And guess what field this residency was in? It was in psychiatry. You know what that meant? He had to go in front of a board of trained psychiatrists for an interview and convince them that he should be in the program. And they said, yeah, come on in.
Wow.
Come on in. So next thing you know, he's treating our nation's heroes at the VA hospital in Northport, Long Island. So I hop in my car with one of my agents, and I go down there to interview this guy. And I tell you something, Mike, he was a handsome, charming, if you didn't know better, if your daughter brought him home and say, hey, Dad, here's Dr. Swango. He's an ex-Marine. He's a VA doctor. You'd say, come on in, buddy. Yeah. Welcome to the family, right?
Yeah.
So I start talking to him, and he's giving me this same cock and bull story about, the barroom brawl. And I'm listening, and I'm smiling, and I'm going along with it. And then I'm looking around his room. So I said, hey, Mike, do you mind if I search your room a little bit while I'm here? And that's when his attitude completely changed. He told us we had to leave. And next thing you know, he leaves the United States. He goes to Zimbabwe, Africa, because there's a real shortage of doctors in Zimbabwe. And when he's in Zimbabwe, Africa, he kills women and children and pregnant women. He was something else. Well, he had to come back to the United States to renew his passport. And that's when we arrested him, but not for murder. because we didn't have any evidence that he murdered anybody at Northport, Long Island. But we had evidence of every federal agent's favorite crime, lying to the government.
Yeah.
Right? If you lie on a form, if you lie to an agent, you're guilty of United States Code 1001 false statements, and he lied, and he's guilty. So he got another 3 years. Now, this gave us a window of opportunity to try to determine if he murdered anybody at the Northport VA. Well, how are we going to do this? I had never done a homicide case before in my life. I was a white-collar crime, drug diversion investigator, yes. Murder, no. So my boss said, don't worry, Bruce. He says, we're going to hook you up with somebody to help you. And I got introduced to a Michael Baden. Michael Baden he used to have a television show actually called Autopsy. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah, it was on HBO.
Yes,
yeah.
That's the man. Yeah. All right. And he says, Bruce, don't worry. I'm going to teach you how to do this. Okay, how do we do this? Well, learning homicide investigation from Michael Swango was like learning physics from Albert Einstein. Yeah. You really couldn't get much of a better teacher. And he said, this is the first thing we're going to do. Because Swango had access to all the patients in the hospital and used to walk around, I want you to pull every medical record of every patient that was at the Northport VA when Michael Swango was there. And then we're going to assemble a team. I'm going to be the forensic pathologist, Michael Baden. He says, you'll be the investigator and you'll have some help. But we're also going to get a physician who's an expert in chart reviews, because he can look at a chart and make a determination that patient really should not have expired when they did.
So that's probably one of the most valuable experts to bring in those cases.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think that's probably where most people would screw up, is that these things don't line up.
That's right. And then a toxicologist to try to determine what poison was used. And then at that time, it was a relatively new profession called forensic nursing. And forensic nursing are nurses that are trained in both nursing science and forensics. And they could translate what these doctors were actually saying, sort of dumb it down for me so that I could understand exactly what they were talking about. They were phenomenal. These forensic nurses, I can't say enough, they were just phenomenal. So we narrowed it down to a number of cases that we thought was suspicious. So what do we do next? So I said, Michael Baden, what do we do next? Do we have to exhume these bodies? And he says, Bruce, you don't ask a barber if you need a haircut, and you don't ask a forensic pathologist if you need an exhumation. So I said, okay. So we had to go to the families. Now imagine getting a visit like this, Mike. All of a sudden I ring your doorbell. I say, Mr. Ritland, my name is Bruce Sackman. I'm a special agent with the Department of Veterans Affairs, Office of Inspector General. We have reason to believe that your father's death at the VA hospital was of a suspicious nature. Can we have your permission to go to the cemetery and exhume his body and dig it up?
I mean, for me, if somebody came to me, I'd be like, hell yeah, you can. Absolutely. Like I would welcome that,
Right. But, different families had different views. I tell you, the families themselves were fantastic. I mean, they were really, sometimes the families would actually want to be there.
Yeah.
They'd actually want to see it themselves.
Yeah, I don't know that I would want to do that, but to me, if there was something suspicious, I would welcome it for sure. But I can assume that you probably ran into some that didn't, though.
Well, we always had a court order, so technically we didn't need their permission. Yeah. But we wanted to do the right thing. Wanted to do the right thing by the families. Sometimes, like a daughter would show up, and our agents would bring her flowers.
Yeah.
We really, our hearts went out to these victims' families, as you could imagine.
Oh, yeah.
Well, next thing you know, I find myself in a graveyard. I've never done anything like this with a backhoe. And it's digging up the ground. Then the coffin comes up out of the ground. Usually there's a lot of water, so the water comes dripping out of the coffin.
Oh, man.
And the next thing you know, Michael Baden is jumping in the gravesite, taking soil samples. What is he doing? He says, well, you see, Bruce, if there's arsenic in the soil and we find arsenic in the body, they're going to claim that it just creeped in there from the soil and had nothing to do with the hospital. Okay. So I find myself at the Suffolk County Medical Examiner's office, and there are bodies laying out there half open. I mean, it's a cultural experience. It takes a little getting used to. You know, I didn't have a problem with it, but we had some people that would walk in, turn around, and walk out. They just couldn't handle it.
Were there ever cases where it had been too long and there wasn't anything left to be able to test or identify? Or
you know what? There's usually something. I haven't had one that it was too long, but the biggest problem, of course, if they're cremated.
Yeah.
And there's no lock of hair, then you're really kind of out of luck. Although some toxicologists will tell me that even in the cremains,
really,
they may be able to find. I'm not a toxicologist. Yeah. This is what I've been told. So I'm at the Suffolk County Medical Examiner's office, and we open up. You know, there's a Y incision that they make, and they open it up. And Michael Baden pulls out a heart, and he says, "Bruce, you see this heart?" Yeah. He says, "There's nothing wrong with this heart. This death certificate that says myocardial infarction, he says, that's bullshit. All right? This guy didn't die from heart disease. There's something else, something external that was administered to him." And that's when we had to go to the largest private lab in the country called the Reader's Lab. And that's when, of course, they had that machine I told you about. And they came back and they said, "We found traces of 2 drugs that should not be in these patients. The first drug, epinephrine again, and the other one was succinylcholine, which is a paralytic, which is used if they want to put a tube down you. It actually paralyzes you. And there's no medical reasons why those drugs should be in those bodies." Wow, terrific. Next thing you know, it's almost time for Swango to get out of jail. Boy, he's chomping at the bit. He's ready to hop on that plane and go back to Africa or God knows where and keep killing people. Well, we actually indicted him for multiple murders at the Northport VA Medical Center. And something really good happened around the same time. The United States entered into an extradition treaty with the government of Zimbabwe. And boy, were they anxious to get their hands on Swango. This blonde-haired, blue-eyed guy from New York who killed a number of their patients, they're just anxious to get their hands on him. So Swango comes out of jail and, you know, he reads the indictment and we say, "Look, Dr. Swango, if we go to trial, and even if you're found not guilty, we're just going to put you on a plane and drop you off on the tarmac in Zimbabwe. Good luck, buddy." Well, he decided to plead guilty.
Wow.
All right? And save us the trial. So then it's time for the trial, and then there is no trial. He pleads guilty, and then there's the sentencing, all right? So at the sentencing, and the sentencings are always very emotional because the families of the victim get up, and they show photographs of dad in service. You know, many of them had numerous awards in service, heroism, only to be killed at a VA hospital. I mean, could you think of something more terrible like that? So the families get up and they talk about it. And then it's time for sentencing. So Michael Swango stands up at attention like an ex-Marine. And he's just calmly talking about how he used a paralytic to kill people. Just come right out like that. And it was unbelievable. And then he sits down and his attorney puts his arm around Michael like he's a poor victim of this. And my boss, the Inspector General, came down from Washington. I thought he wanted to get up and strangle this guy, like right there. So now the judge says, "All right, Dr. Swango, I'm sentencing you to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, and you're going to go to Supermax Federal Penitentiary in Florence, Colorado." Now, right now, there's no parole in the federal system. But if Congress should change the law and grant parole, your parole is denied in advance.
That's awesome.
So he can't get out no matter what.
Wow. What was he a risk? Is that why he went to Supermax or what?
Well, yeah. You know, look, he's been in and out of jail. Yeah. And he's certainly not going to work in the kitchen, that's for sure. No you know, but he actually preferred that. He didn't want to be with the general public because when he was with the general population, when we first put him in, he had this beautiful complexion. I tell you, he looked like a movie star. When he came out, he had this big scar down his face because the prisoners sent him a message, hey, Dr. Swango, don't fuck with us.
Yeah. Wow. Any idea what the total number of people he killed? I know the victims in Africa, it's impossible to quantify, but any idea what the numbers were here in the United States?
A number of people have estimated it worldwide to be about 60.
Wow.
You know, the interesting thing is these medical serial killers kill so many people, they can't remember themselves who these victims are.
Yeah.
Even on the rare occasion when they want to cooperate and they want to talk about it, they can't even remember. They're shown files. They say, I don't remember. Was he one? Wasn't he one? So it's really difficult to accurately quantify how many people they killed. But the numbers are horrific, whether it be 30, 60, 100 or more.
Was there a method of murder that you encountered that was obscure, that was, obviously most of them are poisonings or medications. I'm assuming maybe removing not feeding tubes, but air tubes or, things like that could happen quick. But was there anything that was like, holy shit, how did they do it, that you came across?
Well, I mean, there was, Texas has its number of medical serial killers. If you Google Texas and medical serial killers, you're going to come up with a pretty good number. There was recently one, William Davis, who injected air in the veins. Did you see that in the newspapers? Oh, yeah, and he killed a number of people just with air. I had nothing to do with the case, but it's a pretty interesting case. But out of my own cases, the most unusual one was up in Albany, VA, New York, a Dr. Karnak. Dr. Karnak was a researcher. Now, in order to get funding for research, you have to find a number of patients that you could put in a study, all right? So he says, where am I going to find these patients in Albany? Because if I don't get a number of patients, I'm not going to get money for my study. We want to build a new research center. We want to turn Albany into the research capital of New York. I need patients. Where am I going to get these? Now, in order to be a patient in a research study, you have to have what they call the inclusion and exclusion criteria, which means you have to have the right ailment, you have to have the right blood work, everything has to be right in order for you to be given this experimental drug. So Dr. Karnak says, Jesus Christ, I can't find these people. I tell you what, we have like one or two that really do, and I need 10. So let's find people that are kind of close, and I'll alter their medical records to show that they have the right blood work, that they have the right ailments, that they have everything right to be in that study. And then I'll go to them and I'll say, Mr. Ritland, I know you have this form of cancer and it's very tough to cure, but we have this new experimental drug. And if you sign right here, it may help you. You may actually be able to go to your daughter's wedding now and then. So these veterans had no reason to doubt what Dr. Karnak would say, and he would go in their file and alter their medical records so that they met the inclusion-exclusion criteria. And, of course, a number of them got these drugs, these experimental drugs, not a normal drug that's in the hospital inventory, experimental drug, and expired as a result of that. And that was so unusual. I think it was the first time ever there was a conviction of murder in connection with research. The first time, I mean, there have been a lot of fraud convictions, but never a murder conviction. So when I met this guy, I was so angry. I really wanted to choke him right. I was just so angry at this guy for what he did. But then when I met him, he was like this pathetic human being, like just a loser, a guy who, I want to say I felt sorry for him, but I just kind of lost in anger because he just seemed like so lost in space. And he did this all to bring attention to himself, all for money, all to make him the researcher of the world. And you know what was interesting? The prosecutor on the case, who is now the U.S. attorney in Albany, was actually on the Judge Advocate General's Corps, and the judge was a veteran as well. So I said, oh, boy.
This guy's going to hammer him.
We're going to be good now.
So I'm assuming it wasn't the experimental medication. He was poisoning them on top of that?
No, it was the experimental medication they should have never gotten.
Oh, okay.
That actually was the cause of death.
So what, he was just pushing it because he wanted to, did he know that was going to happen, or he just wanted the trial that bad?
I think he was hoping for the best.
Yeah, wow.
I think he was hoping for the best. But once you start altering medical records to put people in a study, I mean, could you imagine that? If somebody had altered, let's say somebody had altered your dad's medical records to put them in the study and then gave your dad this experimental drug, how would you feel?
I mean, to me, it would be difficult not to take that into my own hands. You know, I mean, really, the level of egregiousness that takes place, again, because there's such a level of kind of implicit trust that exists in the medical field, you know, that you're kind of already handing your life to them to begin with, you know, with complete trust, and like blind trust. I mean, to me, it kind of reminds me of like getting a vasectomy, right? Bear with me for a second. But the reality is, I mean, that's about as compromising of a position as you can put yourself in, and you're just offering it up to somebody else, you know, and you know, trusting that they know what they're doing and to do the right thing. Obviously, that's mostly a joke, but the principle being the same, and that, you know, that level of like, okay, hey, you're the doctor, like you're putting a level of trust that I can't think of really anything other than maybe babysitters, but even then, I mean, you're talking about drugs and procedures and, you know, life-altering protocols that you're entrusting that these people have your best interest in mind, and some of them don't. I mean, hearing these stories, obviously, this is a microcosm of the medical community and does not paint an overall picture of what the healthcare system is like, but it still makes me not want to ever go to a fucking hospital again. Like, you know what, I'm going to ride this one out. I'm just going to see how it goes on my own. Yeah, your femur's sticking out of your thigh. Yeah, I'm gonna see how it pans out.
Well, you know, speaking about not going to hospitals, let's talk a little bit about COVID.
Yeah.
Okay. So, what happened to during the pandemic? What happened with COVID? All right. Well, first of all, as we know, there was a real shortage of medical professionals, and those medical professionals that stayed on the job, they were real heroes. I mean, they worked 24/7. The hospital where I was at in New York, we actually set up a tent in Central Park. I don't know if you remember seeing it.
Yeah.
Because there were so many patients that had come in, and the nurses and doctors were just phenomenal. But what happened during COVID? Well, first of all, the families were not allowed into the hospitals, right? So if you had an advocate, a family member advocating for you, they're not there anymore. And then we had an influx of traveling nurses and doctors, some of which the background investigations we really didn't quite have the time to do. So there are a number of cases ongoing now, a big one in Canada and one in Germany, of COVID-19 patients who were the victims of these kind of crimes. So we'll see what happens. None of them have gone to trial yet. But it's kind of interesting because if you were so inclined to kill, now you have a situation where everything's running helter-skelter. There are new people with no real time to train them. You're putting them right in the front lines.
Zero oversight because nobody's allowed to be there.
That's right. And the family's not there anymore.
Wow, man, that's terrifying. Jesus. You have any good news for us on that?
Yeah, the good news is
you caught a bunch of them.
The majority, the overwhelming majority of healthcare providers are just the most wonderful, caring, dedicated people in the world, which enables my serial killers to hide with them. Yeah. That's the sad part.
I'm assuming that, you know, statistically you're talking about anomaly percentages, right? It's a fraction of a percentage.
Well, the thing is, we don't know.
Yeah.
You see, we don't know. Because so many, you know something, Mike? When I give these training classes and I go around to nurses and law enforcement, but particularly nurses and doctors, and I have my PowerPoint and I teach this, inevitably, at the end of my presentation, somebody will come over to me and say, Bruce, you know, we had this one nurse.
Yeah.
We had this one doctor that we kind of suspected something, but everybody was afraid to say anything, and then he moved on.
Yeah.
And that's kind of scary, Mike.
Yeah. No
that's
shit.
kind of scary.
Like every hospital has that one guy. Yeah, it is. So that brings or begs the question in my mind, in all the cases that either you prosecuted or were a part of, or even that you'd heard of, are there any one-offs where people are convicted for one or two, or is it like there's got to be 10 before there's enough flag raised? Yeah,
well, there actually is one ongoing now with one murder. There is one that was just in the newspapers. There's one now, but the overwhelming majority, almost all of them, is they don't surface until this pattern.
Like 10 or more?
Yeah,
it's
pretty
crazy.
Scary.
It is scary. No, I really don't want to go to the hospital. I'm going to roll the dice. I'm going to pull it up on YouTube and see if I can fix it at home. Man, that's wild. So what are you up to now then, as far as helping with some of this stuff? You talked a little bit about consulting and stuff like that, but what is kind of the path forward for you? Yeah,
the path forward for me is really one of education. Shows like this, going to conferences. I'm going to a couple lined up. Teach. It's just an awareness. Well, an awareness to people that this problem exists.
Yeah. So on that, I mean, obviously the education piece is on the healthcare side. Is there an education component that's even really possible on the user end side for the patient side, where things that you can be aware of or try to help protect yourself, or is that kind of difficult because of the fish out of water?
It's difficult. What I tell patients is it's important to have an advocate with you, a member of your family somebody is frequently there and very politely questions and just takes notes. Because if I'm inclined to kill somebody, I'm not going to kill somebody where, Uncle, he writes down everything, he's like taking notes. I'm going to skip him.
Yeah. Aunt Edith is there with the GoPro fucking documenting everything.
So that's my recommendation.
Yeah.
To patients.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I tell you, it's a fascinating and terrifying story, but one that, while I knew that there were things like this existed, I was not aware that it was at that level, I guess. That's eye-opening for sure. The book is called Behind the Murder Curtain. I appreciate you coming in. I appreciate you writing the book, and for all that you've done. I mean, you've spent, basically your entire life, keeping people honest that, I think, most people are going to give them the benefit of the doubt. And it's reassuring to have guys like you, kind of as the gatekeeper to a certain extent. So I appreciate everything you've done.
Well, thank you very much, Mike.
Yeah. Thanks again for coming on. Appreciate it. Anything else you want to bring up or talk about before we wrap it up?
No, I think that pretty much gives people
gives them a good idea. Is there a best piece of pizza in Long Island before we wrap it up?
Oh, I don't know. I think the pizza in Manhattan is maybe Brooklyn, Manhattan. I think maybe has it, but a lot has to do with the water in pizza.
Yeah, because of the bread, right?
Yeah, well, people take the same formula and they go to Jersey and they say it doesn't taste the same because the water in Manhattan is really the best. So the New York City water makes the best pizza, I think.
Why is that? What's the secret?
I don't know. It's good tasting.
It's the same with bagels, right? Like everybody says
absolutely.
The bagels are, yeah, that's wild.
As a matter of fact, there's a firm in Florida that trucks New York City water down to Florida.
Really? To make their pizza?
Exactly.
That's wild. Is there, what's Long Island most known for food-wise?
Well, I guess seafood.
Seafood,
yeah.
Do you have a favorite?
Oh, I like it all, clams, lobster,
you name it.
You name it.
I don't mean to get off track. Like for me, New York as a whole is fascinating to me. I love the history behind it and just all the culture and personality there. But I could never live there. But I do like that place. Thank you again for coming. Appreciate it. Thank you. For those of you listening, I hope it opened your eyes and you got something out of it. I know I sure did. A lot of things that I wasn't expecting to hear, but again, glad to have patriots like Bruce and other colleagues of his doing what they do to protect us unbeknowing citizens. So thank you. Hope you enjoyed it. If you didn't, choke yourself. Don't poison yourself, choke yourself. And until next time, this is Mic Drop.